Racist cop detains black woman at check-in. Not knowing her intel orders a halt on his entire task division. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Elena Brooks stood calmly at the check-in counter of Hamilton International Airport as the early morning crowd flowed around her like a controlled current, rolling suitcases clicking over polished floors, while overhead screens cycled through departures bound for Chicago, Denver, and San Diego. She appeared unremarkable to the passing eye, dressed in a neutral blazer, flat shoes, and a carry-on that fit airline guidelines perfectly, the kind of traveler no one remembers 5 seconds after walking by. Yet there was a quiet precision in the way she placed her ID on the counter, the way she listened to the agent without interrupting, and the way her eyes tracked the rhythm of the terminal with measured awareness. Officer Daniel Whitmore noticed her for reasons he couldn't quite articulate: a pause in his stride, a tightening at the corners of his mouth, a sense that something didn't fit the pattern he trusted too much. Whitmore had been assigned to a joint task division operating inside the terminal that morning, a layered operation involving local law enforcement and federal coordination, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to quick decisions and unquestioned authority. He approached the counter just as Elena's boarding pass printed, his tone polite on the surface, but edged with suspicion as he requested to see her documents again, explaining it as a routine verification. The surrounding noise softened as a few nearby travelers slowed their steps, curiosity rising in the quiet space between the officer and the woman who met his gaze without flinching. Elena complied without comment, handing over what he asked for, her posture relaxed, shoulders squared, her expression neither defensive nor apologetic. Whitmore scanned the information longer than necessary, asking follow-up questions that drifted beyond standard procedure, his words careful but loaded, his assumptions shaping the pauses between sentences. The check-in agent shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking from the officer to Elena and back again, unsure where her role ended. Elena waited, breathing evenly, the faint hum of the terminal filling the silence as an announcement echoed about a gate change 2 concourses away. Whitmore gestured toward a nearby security desk and suggested continuing the process there, framing it as efficient, routine, nothing to worry about. Elena nodded and stepped aside as directed, moving at a pace that neither hurried nor resisted, aware that every camera above and every badge within reach told a story of systems layered upon systems. At the security desk, Whitmore radioed for confirmation, referencing his task division and the importance of staying on schedule, the language of urgency masking a decision already made. Elena glanced at her watch, not impatiently, just noting time as one does when timing matters, and she offered a brief acknowledgement that she understood the delay. The officer's colleagues hovered at a respectful distance, the operation continuing around them, unaware that a line had been crossed not by action, but by assumption. Elena's calm did not read as submission. It read as certainty, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. As minutes passed, the terminal resumed its rhythm. Travelers moved on, and Whitmore felt the subtle pressure of being observed by the very system he believed he controlled. Elena remained composed, eyes steady, hands relaxed, waiting for the moment when routine would meet reality and the story would begin to turn. The secondary screening area sat just beyond the main flow of the terminal, separated by glass panels that muted the constant announcements and rolling luggage into a distant hum. It was here that Officer Daniel Whitmore felt most at home, surrounded by procedures, radios, and the unspoken understanding that his word carried weight. He stood near a waist-high counter, posture straight, fingers resting near his belt, projecting the calm certainty of someone used to being obeyed, while Elena Brooks remained a few steps away, composed, her carry-on placed neatly beside her feet. Around them, the airport continued its precise choreography, flights boarding on schedule, passengers moving through security lanes measured in minutes, and checkpoints measured in feet, all of it reinforcing the idea that control was absolute in this space. Whitmore reviewed the information on his tablet again, his brow tightening as he searched for a justification that felt solid enough to match the confidence in his voice, asking Elena clarifying questions that sounded official but circled the same ground: where she was traveling from, how long she planned to stay, why her itinerary looked the way it did. Elena answered each question evenly, her tone polite, never rushed, never defensive, offering only what was asked and nothing more, as if she understood that silence often spoke louder than argument. To Whitmore, her calm registered as evasive rather than reassuring, reinforcing a narrative he had already constructed, one shaped by habit and bias more than evidence. He radioed his unit, referencing protocols and time windows, mentioning that the task division could not afford delays that morning, his words clipped and professional, the language of someone who believed efficiency justified scrutiny. A nearby officer nodded along, trusting Whitmore's judgment without question, while a transportation security supervisor glanced over briefly before returning to her screen, accustomed to scenes like this blending into the background of daily operations. Elena observed these interactions quietly, noting the rhythm of authority passing from one uniform to another, aware of how quickly responsibility dissolved into routine when no one challenged it. She shifted her weight slightly, not from discomfort but from awareness, her gaze lifting to the departure board where her flight status remained unchanged, on time, gate assigned, everything proceeding as planned except for this moment. Whitmore stepped aside to make another call, lowering his voice as he spoke about maintaining control and ensuring compliance, the phrasing careful, as if rehearsed, while Elena remained within view of multiple cameras, their small red lights blinking steadily overhead. She knew the exact angles they covered, the timestamp stamped into every frame, the way official records turned moments into data points that outlasted memory. Minutes passed, measured not by impatience, but by accumulation, each one adding weight to a situation Whitmore believed he was managing. He returned with renewed firmness, explaining that further verification was necessary and that she would need to wait until his division cleared the matter, framing the delay as minor, almost considerate. Elena met his gaze, her expression unchanged, and simply acknowledged that she understood, her voice carrying no hint of frustration. Inside, she marked the shift, recognizing that the process had moved beyond curiosity into something procedural, something that would require correction rather than explanation. The airport did. Not slow for them, but the air around the checkpoint felt denser, as if the system itself sensed an imbalance forming. Whitmore remained confident, unaware that the authority he leaned on so comfortably was already approaching its limit, and that the calm woman standing before him was not waiting for permission, but for the precise moment when the structure he trusted would be forced to listen. Elena Brooks had learned long ago that authority revealed more about itself in waiting rooms than in boardrooms, and, as she stood within the glass boundaries of the secondary screening area, she studied the environment with quiet attention, the way the fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead and the way the digital clocks mounted along the wall ticked forward in perfect synchronization. To anyone watching, she appeared patient, almost passive, but beneath that stillness was a practiced awareness shaped by years of moving through controlled spaces where decisions were made without warning and consequences traveled faster than words. She noted the distance between checkpoints, the placement of security cameras measured in feet and angles, and the cadence of radio chatter that rose and fell around Officer Daniel Whitmore like a protective shield. Whitmore continued to operate as if the moment belonged entirely to him, conferring with colleagues, checking screens, and reminding his unit that the task division schedule could not afford disruption, his confidence reinforced by routine and reinforced again by the absence of resistance. Elena listened without intruding, her mind mapping the invisible lines of authority at work, recognizing how easily power flowed when no one questioned its direction. Her calm unsettled Whitmore more than any protest could have, because it did not fit the narrative he expected, and so he filled the silence with procedure, outlining next steps and emphasizing compliance, his tone steady but increasingly rigid. Elena responded only when addressed, her answers clear and complete, never volunteering information that had not been requested, understanding that restraint was often the sharpest instrument in moments like this. She thought briefly of the broader system operating beyond the terminal, of offices miles away and networks spanning states, all of it functioning on trust and timing. And she checked her watch again, not with urgency, but with intention, aware that schedules mattered to those who understood how to use them. The airport continued to move around them, a living organism of announcements and footsteps and rolling luggage, indifferent to the quiet standoff unfolding behind glass. Whitmore glanced toward the departure board and then back to Elena, noting that her flight remained on time. And for a moment he seemed to hesitate, as if considering whether the inconvenience he imposed was justified by anything tangible. That hesitation passed quickly, replaced by a familiar certainty, and he signaled for further verification, citing policy and discretion as if they were interchangeable. Elena met his eyes briefly, her expression composed, and acknowledged his instruction without comment, aware that the process had reached a point where patience would soon give way to clarity. She sensed the subtle shift in the room as other officers became more attentive, curiosity sharpening their focus, and she recognized that the longer the delay continued, the more visible it became within the system Whitmore relied on. She adjusted the strap of her carry-on and stood comfortably, grounded, unhurried, embodying a confidence that did not announce itself but waited. In her silence was an understanding that authority, when misapplied, often accelerated its own unraveling, and that every additional minute added another record, another timestamp, another opportunity for the truth to surface. Whitmore, still unaware of the full scope of what he had initiated, maintained his posture of control, unaware that the calm before him was not uncertainty but calculation. Elena remained exactly where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, letting the machinery of procedure turn on itself, knowing that the moment would arrive when routine met accountability, and that when it did, the system would be forced to recognize the difference between suspicion and reality. By the time the clock above the security desk advanced another few minutes, the tone of the interaction had shifted in ways Officer Daniel Whitmore did not immediately recognize, though his body reacted before his thoughts caught up. His movements became more deliberate, his explanations longer, layered with references to authority and coordination, as if repetition could solidify a decision already made. He informed Elena Brooks that additional confirmation was required due to overlapping task division protocols, emphasizing that the operation in progress demanded absolute certainty, his voice calm but edged with insistence. Elena listened attentively, her face composed, eyes steady, absorbing not just the words but the assumptions beneath them, understanding that escalation rarely announced itself loudly, but arrived through small procedural steps that felt reasonable in isolation. Around them, the secondary screening area drew subtle attention, a transportation supervisor slowing her pace, an airline manager pausing near a kiosk, curiosity spreading quietly as delays became visible. Whitmore sensed the scrutiny and straightened, reminding his colleagues that they were operating well within guidelines, that the process protected everyone involved, language designed to reassure himself as much as others. Elena acknowledged his statements with brief nods, her responses concise, offering no challenge, no protest, allowing the structure of the moment to expand under its own weight. She noted the increased radio traffic, the coded phrases exchanged between units, and the way Whitmore referenced his task division more frequently, as if invoking it granted him additional legitimacy. Her calm persisted, not out of submission but out of calculation, an understanding that impatience would only obscure the clarity she anticipated. Whitmore requested that she remain in the area while he consulted a higher authority within his division, framing the request as temporary and procedural, his tone practiced. Elena agreed without hesitation, her voice even, her posture unchanged, a quiet contrast to the tightening atmosphere. Time stretched, measured now in glances and whispers, as a supervisor approached Whitmore with a question about the delay, and he responded with rehearsed confidence, assuring her that the situation was under control. Elena observed this exchange, recognizing the familiar pattern of deference that accompanied a uniform and a firm voice, and she wondered how often that pattern went unexamined. She shifted her attention to the departure board again, seeing her flight still listed as on time, and considered how systems accommodated disruption until they could no longer ignore it. Whitmore returned from his call with renewed resolve, explaining that the task division required extended verification due to operational sensitivity, his words careful to sound reasonable while extending the delay indefinitely. Elena met his gaze and acknowledged the instruction, her composure unwavering, though she could sense the moment nearing when routine would give way to consequence. The surrounding officers mirrored Whitmore's seriousness, their presence reinforcing the perimeter he believed he controlled, unaware that each additional step tightened the focus of oversight rather than diffusing it. Elena's silence became its own statement, a quiet resistance that required no raised voice, only patience. She knew that escalation, once initiated, demanded resolution, and that the system Whitmore relied on did not tolerate unresolved anomalies for long. The air in the screening area felt heavier, conversations quieter, as if the terminal itself registered the imbalance. Whitmore maintained his stance, confident that procedure would justify his actions, unaware that the very protocols he cited were already recording every decision. Elena remained still, centered, allowing the process to unfold, knowing that the more it expanded, the clearer its flaws would become, and that when accountability arrived, it would not announce itself with force, but with undeniable authority. The delay had stretched long enough that the airport's precision began to feel strained, and within the secondary screening area small details started to surface that Officer Daniel Whitmore did not intend to reveal, but could not fully conceal. He referenced his task division again, while speaking into his radio, his phrasing unusually careful, mentioning clearance windows and coordination checkpoints that suggested a broader operation running parallel to the morning's routine departures. Elena Brooks listened closely, her attention drawn not to the authority in his voice, but to the structure behind it, recognizing terminology that rarely surfaced in casual screening procedures. She remained outwardly calm, hands relaxed at her sides, but her awareness sharpened as she connected each phrase to a larger framework she understood intimately. Whitmore paced a few steps, glancing at the terminal clock and then at his tablet, frustration flickering across his face as timelines compressed and expectations tightened. He spoke about maintaining operational integrity, about the consequences of delay, and about how every minute mattered when divisions were mobilized, words that revealed more than he realized. Elena acknowledged his statements with a brief nod, her expression neutral, as if absorbing information rather than reacting to it. She adjusted her carry-on slightly, ensuring it remained within reach, and her fingers brushed against the smooth surface of her phone without lifting it, a small, almost imperceptible movement that Whitmore noticed but dismissed as nervous habit. Around them, the presence of oversight grew more tangible, supervisors checking screens more frequently, airline staff whispering updates about a stalled passenger, the system beginning to take note of itself. Whitmore attempted to reassert control by clarifying that his division operated under special authorization, his tone firm as he explained that certain names and details could not be disclosed, an explanation intended to end questions rather than invite them. Elena met his eyes briefly, a moment of quiet recognition passing between them, and she replied with a simple acknowledgement that she understood operational sensitivity, her choice of words precise enough to register but not challenge. That single phrase caused Whitmore to pause, his gaze narrowing slightly, as if reconsidering an assumption he had taken for granted. He shook it off quickly, attributing the moment to coincidence, and returned to procedure, requesting status updates and emphasizing urgency. Elena glanced once more at the departure board, noting that her flight remained on time despite the growing ripple of delay around her, and she considered how systems often continued smoothly until they reached a point of sudden correction. She knew that the longer this extended, the more data accumulated, timestamps stacking, recordings aligning, decisions documented in ways that could not be undone. Whitmore received another message over his radio, his posture stiffening as he listened, then responding with clipped assurance that the situation was contained. He mentioned his task division's objectives again, the words sounding increasingly defensive, as if repetition could reinforce authority that was quietly eroding. Elena remained still, her composure unbroken, the calm center around which the tension rotated. She did not rush the moment, understanding that premature action would only dilute its impact, and that clarity required patience. The air felt charged with anticipation, not from confrontation, but from the slow realization that something had been misjudged. Whitmore stood firm, unaware that the fragments he had revealed were already enough to signal a misalignment of power, and that the woman he continued to detain was not waiting to be cleared, but allowing the process to expose itself fully before the inevitable shift. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood in front of Elena Brooks, his posture rigid, his expression unwavering as he continued to justify the delay, speaking in the calm, clipped manner of someone who believed he had already handled the situation. The words he used, protocol, task division, and security clearance, rang out, the repetition designed to reinforce an illusion of control. He glanced at his tablet again, scrolling through the information as if the simple act of reviewing data would make the delay seem more reasonable. But Elena's silence in response only seemed to draw the situation out longer, her patience working against him. She did not protest, did not demand answers. She simply waited, her eyes steady, her gaze never wavering, absorbing everything without comment. Around them, the terminal continued its slow, rhythmic pulse, passengers moving between gates, the soft chatter of voices blending with the distant sound of rolling luggage. Yet within this space, everything felt suspended, as though time had slowed, waiting for a decision to tip the balance. Whitmore turned to his colleagues once more, speaking to them in low tones about a potential oversight in the system. His language had shifted, no longer confident but tinged with an edge of uncertainty, as if the longer he spoke, the less sure he became of the correctness of his actions. His radio crackled again, this time with a request for a higher-level confirmation. He sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sign of his growing frustration. It was clear that this delay, which he had thought would be resolved quickly, was now evolving into something far more complex, and he was left scrambling to hold everything together. Elena, on the other hand, remained entirely at ease, her posture relaxed but purposeful, her expression neutral, as though she had been placed here not by accident but by design, aware of the waiting game, understanding that the outcome would be determined not by force, but by the weight of information and the sharpness of timing. The minutes stretched on, one blending into the next, until finally, Whitmore returned his attention to Elena. His face had softened slightly, as if the length of the delay had begun to take its toll. He spoke again, but this time his voice lacked its earlier firmness. "I'm afraid we'll need a few more moments," he said, his tone no longer carrying the same sense of authority. Elena nodded slightly, as if acknowledging his statement, but said nothing. Inside her, she knew the moment had arrived. She felt it, the shift that had been quietly unfolding in the background, a moment when the balance of power would reverse without a single word spoken. It wasn't the moment of confrontation that would determine the outcome, but the quiet certainty that came from being in the right place at the right time, surrounded by a system that had no choice but to follow its own rules. Whitmore glanced back at the tablet, his fingers hovering over the screen, unsure of his next step. It was in that moment, that fleeting moment of hesitation, that Elena's phone buzzed softly in her bag. She did not reach for it immediately, but her mind processed the alert that had come through. The time had arrived. Elena's calmness had never wavered because she knew something Whitmore did not. She was not simply waiting to be cleared. She was waiting for the moment when everything he had built would collapse, and she would be the one to set it in motion, not through confrontation, but through the simple, undeniable force of truth. Her flight was still on time, her patience unwavering. The system was already recording, and soon it would have no choice but to acknowledge the truth Whitmore had missed entirely. The room seemed to hold its breath, the steady hum of the terminal distant in the background as Officer Daniel Whitmore stood, staring at his tablet, his mind racing through the last few moments. He had been so sure that the delay would resolve itself quickly, that the system would unfold as it always did, following a predictable path. But now, standing in front of Elena Brooks, everything felt more uncertain. His radio crackled again, pulling his attention back to the present. His voice was clipped as he responded, his words more guarded this time. He mentioned needing to escalate the situation further, referring to a higher authority for approval. Elena remained standing, her expression unchanged, her patience a silent force pressing against the tension in the air. The other officers in the room exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity, but none of them dared to speak out. Whitmore was the one in charge, and they had learned long ago that questioning his decisions rarely ended well. But today was different. Elena knew it. Whitmore didn't. She had seen how things unfolded in controlled environments like this, how power was applied until it wasn't. She could sense that Whitmore's confidence was cracking piece by piece. Elena glanced at the time, noting how much of it had passed since the initial encounter. Her flight was still on schedule, but it no longer mattered. She wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't waiting for approval. She was waiting for the moment when the system would have no choice but to acknowledge what it had missed. Whitmore stood there, oblivious to the shift in the air, still talking into his radio, explaining the situation in language that was designed to reinforce his control, yet there was a hesitance in his voice now, a subtle wobble that he couldn't quite hide. Elena's gaze never wavered. She understood the gravity of the situation, but she also understood the mechanics of this moment, the way authority could be lost not in an instant, but in a series of small, unnoticed steps. The radio clicked off, and Whitmore turned back to Elena, his expression tense. He explained that a few more details were required, that he needed to confirm something with a supervisor. Elena nodded, her response simple. She had long since stopped feeling any need to justify herself. She was simply waiting, observing the subtle erosion of his certainty. With every additional delay, the weight of the situation shifted further from him. Whitmore began to feel the pressure mount, his breath coming slightly quicker now, his gaze flicking nervously between Elena and his colleagues. He wasn't used to being questioned, not like this. He was used to being the one who controlled the room, who set the pace. But Elena's stillness, her unyielding calm, was disorienting. It didn't fit into any of the categories he had been trained to recognize. And that uncertainty was beginning to take its toll. His grip on the situation felt less sure, less stable, and for the first time since this had all begun, he wondered if he had miscalculated. Elena, on the other hand, knew exactly what was happening. The system he had leaned on was built on assumptions, on patterns, on the idea that those with power never had to question themselves. But Elena wasn't here by mistake. She wasn't a passenger to be processed. She wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a force moving quietly through the cracks in the system, waiting for it to break under its own weight. Whitmore turned away again, speaking quietly to another officer, his voice carrying a thread of frustration, but the words no longer held the same authority they once had. Elena stood, quietly observing, knowing that the moment of change was drawing nearer. The system was about to recognize its own failure, and in that recognition, it would be forced to shift, and she would be there, calmly watching it unfold. The tension in the secondary screening area had reached a palpable peak, the minutes stretching endlessly as Elena stood, her calm presence an anchor amidst the growing unease. Officer Daniel Whitmore continued to speak into his radio, his words increasingly strained, his authority now faltering with every minute of delay. Elena, however, remained unshaken, her posture poised, her gaze unwavering as she observed the subtle cracks appearing in the system that had, until now, functioned without question. Whitmore's frustration was evident in the quickness of his speech, the increasing volume of his orders. Yet the more he attempted to control the situation, the more the environment around him began to slip away. The officers who had been standing with him, their expressions once confident, now exchanged uncertain glances, their silence speaking louder than words. Elena's silence, on the other hand, remained as steady as ever, a quiet force that began to expose the limits of Whitmore's control. The terminal around them continued its regular rhythm, oblivious to the standoff unfolding in its midst. Passengers walked past, unaware of the tension that had built between Elena and the officers, each footstep echoing in the sterile air as if the world continued to spin without noticing the brief pause in the larger system. Finally, Whitmore turned back to Elena, his earlier composure now completely replaced by the thin veneer of professionalism he clung to. He spoke again, this time his tone much softer, almost hesitant. "We're just waiting for confirmation," he said, his words trailing off, as if uncertain whether this explanation would be enough. Elena nodded slightly, her expression unchanged, giving him no reassurance, no indication that she was buying into his reassurances. She was waiting for the moment when his words would no longer hold weight, when the system he depended on would be forced to acknowledge its own failure. The longer the delay, the more pressure built, and the more fragile Whitmore's position became. The system, for all its rigid procedures and established norms, had no answer for a situation like this, no response for someone who simply refused to be rattled by its machinery. Whitmore glanced at his colleagues again, his brow furrowing as he received yet another communication, his hand tightening on the tablet in his grasp. The usual clarity of his commands was slipping away, and he found himself grasping at the familiar, repeating the same instructions, re-explaining the necessity of the delay, as if the words themselves could undo the growing dissonance in the room. Elena, however, remained still, her attention focused not on Whitmore or his colleagues, but on the system itself, the network of decisions and protocols, the web of authority and oversight that had, until now, worked to his advantage, but was now being tested by his inability to move things forward. The terminal's hum seemed louder now, as if the world was beginning to notice the pause, the way time itself was being suspended in a moment of unresolved tension. Elena's gaze shifted momentarily, not to her phone or the departure board, but inward, to the quiet certainty she carried with her. She had known all along that the moment would come when Whitmore would be forced to acknowledge the weight of his actions, when a system that had been built on assumptions would have to confront the reality that Elena was not just another passenger to be processed, not just another delay to be explained away. She was a force moving through the cracks of a machine that thought it was invulnerable, and with every passing second, that machine was beginning to break down under the weight of its own inertia. Whitmore continued his frantic exchange of messages, but his voice, once confident, now wavered as the realization set in that this was no longer just a delay. It was a reckoning. Elena stood silently, feeling the tide shift beneath her feet. The system was breaking, and in that moment, she knew that no matter how much Whitmore tried to maintain control, it was already too late. The moment had arrived. The air in the secondary screening area felt thick, the hum of the terminal almost deafening in the quiet space where everything seemed to be on the edge of a decision. Officer Daniel Whitmore's grip on his tablet tightened, his knuckles whitening as he stared at the screen, his mind racing through the latest communication he'd just received. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a palpable sense of unease that he couldn't hide. Elena Brooks remained standing, her posture calm and measured, as if the world around her was slowly unfurling in real time, every action and decision playing out with precision. She had seen it before, the way systems like this could fracture when their limits were tested. Whitmore, still clutching the tablet as though it could provide him with the answers he so desperately needed, finally looked up at Elena. For the first time in what felt like hours, his gaze faltered, And in that moment, Elena knew the inevitable was unfolding before him. She had given the system ample time to rectify its own mistake, but had only spiraled deeper into its own bureaucracy, unable to resolve what had begun as a simple check-in procedure. Elena's stillness had been the catalyst, not for confrontation, but for the recognition that what was happening around them was a flaw in the system that could no longer be ignored. She knew it was time. The moment had arrived, and now the system would have to bend, not through force, but through the undeniable reality of what had transpired. Whitmore's voice wavered slightly as he spoke again, his words no longer carrying the same assurance they once had. "I need to call in one more person to confirm," he said, though it was clear to anyone listening that the tone had shifted from command to uncertainty. Elena did not respond immediately, only watching him with the same unbroken calm. She had played her part, allowed the system to reach the point where it would have no choice but to confront the imbalance it had created. Whitmore, noticing the silence, took a step back, his hand hovering near his radio, his mind searching for a way to salvage control over a situation that was already slipping from his grasp. The clock continued to tick, each passing second a reminder that time had passed beyond the point of no return. Elena's phone buzzed softly in her bag, the subtle vibration almost inaudible amidst the quiet tension of the room. She didn't need to check it, already knowing what the message would say. The moment had arrived. She had waited for this precise moment, the moment when the system would have no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Whitmore's attempts to regain control were futile now, his every word betraying his growing discomfort, his authority diminishing with each attempt to justify the delay. Elena could see it in his eyes now. He understood. The shift had already taken place. He was no longer in charge of the situation. The situation was in the hands of the system he had relied on, and it was beginning to respond in ways he had never anticipated. Elena turned slightly, her attention no longer on Whitmore, but on the larger operation unfolding around them. The terminal continued its steady rhythm, passengers moving in and out of gates, unaware of the quiet collapse of authority that had just taken place. Whitmore, still trying to salvage what little remained of his control, looked at the clock again. His face betrayed his frustration, his uncertainty. And then, without warning, Elena spoke, her voice calm and steady, yet carrying a weight that made Whitmore pause. "It's time," she said simply, the words echoing softly in the charged air between them. The realization hit him like a quiet wave, and for the first time, Whitmore recognized that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The system had failed, and in the silence that followed, it was clear that nothing more needed to be said.